Hey everyone, and welcome to Fast Talk, your source for the science of cycling performance. I'm your host, Chris Case, and this is the best of 2020. What a year it's been, eh? In so many ways, 2020 was one big challenge. Sometimes big, sometimes small, but always a bit more challenging. The same goes even for this humble podcast. But through it all, we stayed connected, virtually, most of the time, across time zones, across international borders, and despite waves of pandemic disruptions. We did it all to bring you what we think are some incredible conversations with exceptional minds in the worlds of physiology, medicine, nutrition, sports psychology, and of course, cycling throughout. Who, specifically, will you hear from today? First, there's world-famous physiologist Dr. Iñigo San Millán, who also happens to be the head of the training staff of UAE Team Emirates, the team of Tour de France winner Tadej Pogačar. We'll hear from the coach of America's most talented cyclists, Jim Miller. A best-of episode wouldn't be complete without the incomparable Dr. Steven Seiler. We'll also hear from outspoken, sometimes sassy, Sebastian Weber of Inside. We'll get words of wisdom from the legend, Joe Friel. We'll hear from Fast Talk Labs contributor Julie Young, and we'll catch up with some incredible athletes, including climbing sensation Sepp Kuss and national champ Ruth Winder. All those guests and many more today on Fast Talk. You'll notice several themes that come out in this episode, a function of the fact that we kept revisiting these topics throughout the year. One thing Fast Talk has taught us, and we hope you as well, is that by discussing these topics with intelligent guests, we develop a better understanding of where training, science, and practice converge and where it's headed. Some of the themes we'll touch upon include leaving complexity out of your intervals, the execution of workouts and using feeling versus data, using ranges versus specific numbers, and much more. The Fast Talk team has enjoyed every minute of creating this show for you. Likewise, we've loved sifting through our collection of episodes from the past year to gather the best of 2020. Thank you for your continued support. We couldn't do it without you. So here's to 2021 and a return to bike racing for all of us. Let's hope, and let's make you fast. What a year. Of course, there were many good things that happened in 2020 as well. Among them, we launched Fast Talk Laboratories, our new coaching, education, and community program. In just a few weeks, we will be announcing some exciting new features and services that we'd like you to enjoy. So why not sign up for our free listener member level? You'll get our weekly newsletter, where we announce new offers, and get access to full transcripts of every episode, including today's, our Best of 2020 review. Join us at fasttalklabs.com. In this clip, we're going to hear from Dr. San Millán. This is from episode 109 on the metabolic cost of your rides. Dr. San Millán takes us sort of deep inside the human physiology about the metabolic flux that's taking place in an individual, but the differences between an amateur and a pro and some of the molecular mechanisms that are affected here. Trevor, tell us why you chose this episode.
This is an episode that I had been wanting to do for years. It's a question that I keep re-asking myself, and I'm going to say I still don't know where I stand. I keep going back and forth. That sometimes I feel like, when a pro and an amateur go out for a Zone 2 ride, you're getting the exact same adaptations. There are other times where it just seems the evidence points the opposite, that it has very different effects on them. So it was fun getting somebody as knowledgeable as Dr. Iñigo San Millán on to have this discussion with, to go into a lot of the physiology of it and even to get into reactive oxygen species, which is not what you would expect to discuss when you're talking about Zone 2 rides.
All right, let's hear from Dr. San Millán.
What is the difference
that 300 watts, even though it's the same relative intensity, what is the difference for the pro versus the amateur when one is up close to 300 watts, one's at 180 watts? What's the different effects on their engine?
You need to produce a lot more ATP, right, to run that engine, right, at that speed or at that power output. And for that, you need to mobilize different metabolic sources. So the elite athlete is extremely good at oxidizing carbohydrates and even fatty acids at these intensities, whereas the amateur athlete at those intensities of 300 watts, they're not oxidizing fat at all, and everything is glycolytic, and therefore they produce a lot of lactate. So for those people, that the same metabolic state, it would be more at 180 watts, for example, as we keep referring to the 180 watts, for example, right? That's what they would be at the same metabolic level. But if you want to go from 180 watts to 300 watts, you're going to have to mobilize a lot more energy. Or you're going to have to produce, to oxidize a lot more pyruvate for energy, and you're going to produce a lot more lactate. But you need to oxidize that lactate, and this is the capacity, and everything happens in the mitochondria. And this is why these elite athletes have an amazing mitochondrial function, which can oxidize the pyruvate, and they can oxidize also the fatty acids, and also they produce largest amount of lactate as a result of pyruvate oxidation, but they oxidize lactate very well within the mitochondria mainly, as well as in adjacent mitochondria and in also as low-twitch muscle fibers.
So I get with the amateurs that if they go up to 300 watts, it's very different. But I guess the question here is if they're both in their zone too, if they're both riding at aerobic threshold, is it the same thing?
Yeah, I would say so. Metabolically speaking, I would say it is the same metabolic stress or the same metabolic situation.
Even though with the pro, we're looking at a situation where they are requiring a lot more energy. They're requiring a higher oxygen consumption to produce their higher wattage.
Well, but this is what I would like to, in my opinion, I don't look at oxygen consumption anymore. Right? I look more about the metabolic level. I think we've been for decades talking about oxygen. And from at least what we're seeing with muscle biopsies, we're correlating with looking at genomics, metabolomics, proteomics. We're looking at transcriptomics. We're looking also at even exosomes. And we're now at, like opening new areas where we're looking specifically at the very cellular level. And we already see that there's little correlation with oxygen consumption within the same group. So that's what I would not like to get stuck in the oxygen consumption, right? I think it's more about what happens at the cellular level, right? So those athletes, they have a much higher capacity to mobilize fuels, whether it's from carbohydrate source, whether it's from fatty acid source, or whether it is from lipid, from amino acids, right, or fatty acids. So and for that, the mitochondria it's key for that. So at 300 watts, obviously the muscle contraction force, it's much higher than what it is at 180 watts. So you require more substrate, right? And those substrates are more carbohydrate oxidation. You need more fatty acids, and you need also more amino acids as well to produce ATP. Because at the end of the day, metabolic stress is about ATP synthesis rate as well. But an athlete who doesn't have the same capabilities can only do that at 180 watts, for example. If that athlete wanted, so there would be at a similar homeostasis, if you will, level, but with lower fat oxidation, lower carbohydrate oxidation, and lower amino acid oxidation. And that's the capacity that the well-trained athlete has. I know it's complicated, but
it is an interesting question. That's very complicated. But going back to what you were saying about the substrates, they're both in their zone too. The pro, to generate that 300 watts compared to the 180 watts from the amateur, that pro is going to be burning a lot more calories per minute. How are they doing that? Are both going to be relying equally on fat versus carbohydrates, or are you going to see a different reliance?
Yeah, in total number, again, the elite athlete has a much higher capacity to burn or oxidize carbohydrates or fatty acids or amino acids. Therefore, they can afford to produce or synthesize so much energy, ATP, that is needed to produce 400 or 300 watts. However, the amateur athlete cannot get there, doesn't have enough mitochondrial function, doesn't have enough glycolytic capacity, doesn't have enough lactic clearance capacity and fat oxidation. So therefore, can only do at a maybe, if you will, a percentage of the metabolic stress, the maximum metabolic stress can only do 180 watts. And we see that in the laboratory, that at that level, for example, the elite athlete is burning or oxidizing 0.7 grams per minute of fatty acid. And at the same level, the amateur or moderately active athlete can only do 0.3. So we're talking about more than twice. And this is what we're seeing in with muscle biopsies as well. In the muscle biopsy, what we do is like we take a chunk of muscle and we inject directly into that muscle biopsy different substrates. We look at pyruvate, we look at, which is the representative of carbohydrates. We also look at lactate, which is also the end product of glycolysis and a main carbohydrate source as well. And we also inject fatty acids and inject amino acids, in this case is glutamine, and that we see how they utilize it compared to the in between groups. So we see that they have a much higher capacity to utilize all substrates. So I would say, going back to the analogy of the car, right? If a Ferrari, for example, can go like let's say at 150 miles an hour, and it's maybe going at 50% of the maximum metabolic stress, if you will, of that engine, right? Whereas Volkswagen, for example, as you said, 150 miles an hour, that car is maxed out, right? So that car, to go at that 50% of the maximum engine capacity, has to go at 70 miles an hour. Now, the gasoline consumption at 70 miles an hour, the Volkswagen, that is the substrate, is a lot less than that of the Ferrari.
So one of the things I found really interesting, when I was researching for my article, I was looking into that and who it had a bigger impact on. And I'll give you my honest opinion. Going into it, I thought, well, the pros doing 5 hours at 300 watts, that's going to have a much bigger cost to them, even though they are better trained than the amateur riding at 180 watts. But I actually, at least the research I read, saw that it might actually be the opposite. You're saying it's the same. But one of the things that I found that was very interesting was looking at ROS production, reactive oxygen species. This is one of the things that causes damage. It's one of the things that causes inflammation after training. You do a lot of hard training or you do a big volume of training, you're going to produce ROS. And then your body needs to adapt. It needs to repair the damage caused by that. And I even found an interesting study that showed that too much ROS is what leads to overreaching and overtraining. And there was this one great study that shocked me that showed that in amateurs, less experienced cyclists, it was very easy for them to quickly overwhelm their antioxidant system and produce a lot of inflammation. Where they looked at pros, put them in a 4-day, so this was actually a study with pros, had them do a 4-day top European stage race, and showed by the end of that stage race, there was actually a net reduction in ROS because their antioxidant system was so good. So what I was reading in some of this research is actually that 5-hour ride, even though the amateur's doing it at 180 watts, might actually be more stressful on the amateur than the 300-watt ride on the pro, because the amateur might get overwhelmed by the oxidative stress where the pro wouldn't.
Yeah, well, that could be, that's maybe something adjacent, right, or separate than the bioenergetics. and it's more like what's the toll, right?
Right.
I say that we still don't know for certain because we need to do a lot more research, in my opinion, right? I think that there are not many researchers out there. I have been using or measuring ROS in athletes since 2002 or 2003, I forgot. So it's been close to 20 years doing that with the micromethod photometer, where I look at hydrogen peroxide, which is the most representative ROS probably. And one thing that we see very clearly that and I've done this in Grand Tours, I have done this in Vuelta, I have done this in the Tour de France, and as the stages progress, the ROS of those cyclists increase. And but that said too, that's because we're talking about the Vuelta or the Tour de France. We're looking at a Grand Tour, right. And the metabolic stress on these guys is tremendous, right? Whereas I don't see that with, for example, during the training load. The one thing that I've seen is that, and I still probably don't know why. That's what we need to do more research. Is that those elite athletes, they normally have lower ROS levels. That's what I've seen over the years. The better ones have lower ROS than the other ones, both during training, both at rest, and both also during like a Grand Tour. And this is data that, again, we haven't published it because there's so many data out there that we need to I need to put together from 20 years that I didn't have the time. But I've been observing that for a long time. The one thing that we also know is that these athletes, it's very possible that they have a higher, it's possible, it's been shown that they have a higher antioxidant capacity, endogenous. This is another thing that we're looking also with metabolomics. We're looking also at the antioxidant capacity of athletes, and absolutely we see that there are differences in the antioxidant capacity of different athletes within the same group. So it's very possible that definitely they have a better antioxidant capacity than other athletes of lower performance level.
Is the antioxidant capacity something that allows them to be better athletes, or does that come about because they've trained so much? Which comes first?
Well, that's a very good question. That's what we don't know very well. I think that maybe it's a capacity that maybe they're not as tasked, right, while they compete or train, or maybe just they have a much higher recovery capacity, which is something that we see. So we're seeing, for example, and this is something that we're going to start publishing data because we're acquiring it already. We see something that is not in the books, or at least I haven't seen it in the literature, where we thought always that the elite athletes didn't use much protein, right? Because they use mostly fat and carbohydrates, and protein they don't use much because they don't want to get catabolic. Well, in fact, we're seeing that they use more protein than the other athletes, but they also, so they get more catabolic during the race, for example. Excuse me. However, we see also that their anabolic capacity and those amino acids in charge of anabolism, they're also higher. So this is very really cool thing that we have observed because I was myself the first one who was like not, it was a shock to see that, right? So that's why there are a lot of things that we're trying to understand, but without a doubt, it's a good question that we're trying to understand whether it's like they go through a lower effort or less task, metabolically speaking, or simply they go even about the same, but they have a much better recovery capacity, which in my opinion, I would be more inclined towards the latter, right? That they might have a better recovery capacity in between sessions, which is something that, empirically, or we see that, from the feedback from the athletes. You see athletes who are, after a stage race, they need 4 or 5 days to recover, and other ones within 2 days, they're ready to go. and they tell you, hey, I need to start doing training again because I'm ready to go. And I'm not going to name people, but we see that, with athletes, which shocks me, because those athletes, and that's what you see. Wow, those athletes are amazing. They recover very well.
Yeah.
And we're starting to see that at the cellular level, because why in the world this guy is telling me 2 days later that he's ready to go again, versus the other guy that I'm talking to and he said he's still tired and he went for a 2-hour ride and their legs hurt. And the other guy wants to do 5 hours. Now we're starting to see the signatures at the cellular level very well differentiated. And it's everything. It's just that they have a higher antioxidant capacity, a higher recovery capacity. During the race, they don't suffer as much. They also synthesize glycogen. That's another thing that we're seeing. These athletes, they synthesize glycogen much better and at a higher rate than others, and therefore they don't lose so much glycogen during the race or in between days, and they can fill it up the tank faster, so they have less proteolysis, less catabolism, etc. So it's not. I don't think it's one door only. It's everything that you can imagine. Right. In terms of bioenergetics, recovery, antioxidants, whatever they just do better.
Now we'll hear from Jim Miller. This is from episode 121. Should you build the best engine or focus on specificity? And this was a great conversation overall. A lot of golden nuggets, if you will, that came out of this episode. But we want to focus in on one in particular. Trevor, tell us what we're going to hear.
There's been a few themes that we have ended up landing on in 2020 that we touched back on either in successive episodes, or we'd get lots of questions and it would end up in Q&As. And this is one of those things that became a theme for us in 2020, which is this idea of, should you be doing really complex intervals where you need an engineering degree to read it? Or is it just, as some of our guests have said, time and intensity, where could you take it as far as, does recovery length matter that much? Does it really matter how much time you're spending at intensity? I mean, obviously we feel these things are important, but you're going to hear Jim Miller say that doing really complex intervals isn't really his style, that it's much more about, let's just do simple intervals where you're hitting the right energy system.
All right, let's hear from Jim now.
What is your opinion on intervals? So we've had Dr. Seiler on the show who has taken more of the approach of it's just time at intensity. However you want to cut that. Versus there's a lot of people go, well, you're this type of rider, you got this type of event, so you have to do this specific order of intervals because that's highly specific to the event. What's your feeling? Are intervals, or do the intervals really need to be tailored to the event type?
I tend to agree with Seiler on most things. I love listening to him talk. He's extremely knowledgeable in his field, and that Southern drawl just kind of sucks you in.
Yes, it does.
We were talking about that mix between a Texan accent and a Norwegian accent. You could just listen to it all day. I've never heard that before.
He's got a smooth delivery, that guy.
He does, and whether I don't know. I agree with him. I tend to think that our body, and how we define these energy systems and specifically intervals, it's not that fine. We're not that sophisticated. When you tell somebody 280, the body really doesn't know the difference between 278, 275, 283, etc. So I tend to dump things into bigger buckets, change the intervals up accordingly. I do take a threshold interval, and I like to do it a couple ways. I do long threshold intervals, 15 minutes, 10, 15, 20 minutes, when we're building fitness. But then when we start to get to race season, then I think that the broken intervals, the 3 on 1 off, but you're doing 15 minutes of it, tends to elicit a little bit different response. You end up with a higher power output. It's a harder interval. And I think for your bang for your buck in racing, you get more out of that. But honestly, I think that Seiler's right, that a lot of this goes into big buckets, and it's number and duration.
So I actually last night tried to find some studies that countered this. And again, this goes back to that contradiction we talked about building the engine, you want to target the particular capacities. And so here's our next contradiction, which is I kept finding in the studies exactly what you're saying, which was high intensity is high intensity. It just doesn't matter. So I found one study of cyclists where they had one group of cyclists doing they're comparing it to your VO2 max power. So one group was doing their interval work above VO2 max. The other group was doing what they were calling submax intensity. So about, I think it was 90% of their VO2 max, so pretty close to their threshold. And they were looking at improvements in time trial performance, and both groups had exactly the same improvement. They had another study in runners where they were looking at improvements in their 10K time. And they had one group of runners, again, doing more threshold type work, and they had the other group of runners doing sprint work. So super short, super high intensity, and again, exact same improvement in their 10K time. Mm-hmm. So just again and again and again, it was just simply, you got to do some high intensity work. And I did find studies that said, well, if you don't do high intensity work, no, you can't perform that well. So you have to have some. But after that, it just doesn't, all this belief that, well, sprint work trains this and Tabatas trained that and threshold trains that, it doesn't necessarily seem to be panning out. It sounds like that's kind of what you're saying as well.
I think I'd probably break my buckets into that, above threshold, below threshold, at threshold, maybe below threshold, and then just that aerobic zone. But within those buckets, then, yeah, mix it up, change the number of intervals, change the length of them, change the power slightly, change the requirements, but I still think they group into those three main buckets.
Now let's turn to episode 127, Overreaching, Overtraining, and Burnout with Dr. Steven Seiler. We couldn't have a best of 2020 episode without Dr. Seiler in it. And this was an episode where he liked to define some terms, clarify some things, scold Trevor a little bit. But Trevor, you also have a personal history with this aspect of training. So tell us a little bit more about what Dr. Seiler is going to talk about.
This is probably my favorite episode of 2020. It was a fun recording. I thought there was a lot of good information in it from Dr. Seiler. I also spent a lot of time researching for this one and thoroughly enjoyed that research. But where we started, and I just think this is a really important thing to replay, is defining these different terms. What is burnout? What is functional overreach? What is non-functional overreach? And what is overtraining? They're all different things that we sometimes use interchangeably, and it's really important to understand what each is and which you should avoid and which, if you're careful, you can actually use.
Excellent. Let's hear from Dr. Seiler now.
You do a workout and you're tired after, and that's normal. You know, that we train and we're fatigued immediately after, and maybe for hours after to the next day, and hopefully we're recovered and we train again. So this is a cycle that we go through all the time as athletes. Now we take it a step higher, and we're in a normal training routine. We're pushing, but now we want a little extra. We want to really, we add some volume, or we add an extra interval session each week, or we add even more, and we start stretching that rubber band, you might say, as a metaphor, with the intention that it will bounce back. We'll get a kind of an overshoot, and that's that classic general adaptation syndrome from our hero Celia way back decades ago. And athletes use this, in training camps, in preparation for big events. They really dig in. They have the intention of sometimes, digging a bit of a hole for themselves. Swimmers are notorious for this. And then getting a super compensation. And if they get that right, then that's what we call functional overreaching. So it's an intentional taking out the shovel, digging a bit of a hole for yourself physically, where performance actually declines a bit, you're really, you're pushing the volume, you're pushing the training load, and then you let up on the gas pedal. You give your body some recovery time in a taper, and you get, maybe a 3% overshoot. Well, that's fantastic. So that's functional overreaching. It may take days up to maybe 2 weeks to come all the way back and get that overshoot. Now, non-functional overreaching, it's not hard to imagine that just, you took it too far. It didn't work. You end up kind of damaging the rubber band, and you don't get the overshoot. And in fact, you get a delayed recovery. So you're starting down that pathway towards a more profound and more long-term deficit functionally. And this can take several weeks, maybe a month to come back from, maybe 2 months to come back from. But it's a fuzzy, the key difference definitionally between functional and non-functional is just, it's the function. Did you get that super compensation as planned, or did you end up limping back to normalcy after weeks of things not going well? And that championship event you were supposed to be really primed for, you end up sucking. You just weren't there because you end up pushing too hard. That's a typical non-functional overreaching situation.
That's really important. You can even see a non-functional overreach if it takes too long to come out of it. If it takes that month or longer, you can detrain. So you can come out of it weaker, not stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a critical distinction. And let's be honest, I would almost say functional overreaching is not for beginners. That process, it tends to be successful in athletes and coach-athlete groups or teams that really are tuned in, and they know how much they can stretch that rubber band. They know that they've learned through experience what the athlete tolerates. And because it's tricky, and it can easily go the wrong way.
Yeah, you've used the rubber band analogy. You could also maybe talk about walking sort of right up to an edge with overreaching, and if you don't get it right, you go off the cliff. Or if you stretch the rubber band too much, you snap that rubber band, and that's where we get into problems.
A lot of coaches like talking about the razor's edge. So functional overreach is going to the edge. Non-functional overreach is going over the edge.
Yeah, and there are some sports. Swimming, I think, would be the one that I see most common. That is, functional overreaching is almost built into the psyche of the athlete. It's almost like they don't know how to not do that before a major competition. They really dig in deep. They count on that kind of super compensation from a hard overreach situation. But there's been some research. There are some studies that say that they're not even sure this actually works. That if you just train smart, you end up the same place. So the whole idea, I think it does work for some if they know how to do it, if they get that, the increase appropriate, because it always involves an increase in training load, either through volume or intensity or both. So you are purposefully increasing the load at a higher rate of increase than you normally would. And that's usually a recipe for problems. When you do a pretty drastic increase in volume or, overall training stress, then there will be some negative consequences. Here, the goal is that, yes, we want that to happen, but we're going to control it so well that it's going to give us a bounce back.
Yep.
That's what you're gambling on.
I did a lot of research for this one, but I think the study or review I spent the most time on that I found really interesting was from this year, February of 2020, by a Dr. Bellinger. And the title of it is Functional Overreaching in Endurance Athletes, a Necessity or Cause for Concern.
And he makes a pretty good case for the fact that, well, yes, you can get a supercompensation from functional overreach when you look at studies that compare functionally overreached athletes to athletes who just increase their training load but don't get functionally overreached. You see pretty equal supercompensation. So he's really questioning, is it necessary at all? So before that, let's finish defining overtraining and burnout, and then we can talk about how to differentiate them.
Right. So if you go several steps further, and if you have an athlete that has solved every problem with doubling down on training load, meaning that when it hasn't gone well, they have answered that problem by saying, well, I need to train more, they will be a candidate for that ultimate problem, which is overtraining, this overtraining syndrome. Now, the reason overtraining has been given this extra word at the end, a syndrome, is because syndromes mean that there's several ways to get there. And when that happens, in other words, there's this set of symptomology that may happen because of several different mechanisms, then they end up calling it a syndrome. And that's kind of where we're at with overtraining. You can be overtrained. Like I talked to a national team coach, and he says, look, we've had overtraining cases because of viruses, because of infections, where you've got this highly trained athlete that is on the razor's edge, but they're okay, they're doing well, and then they get mono or some other kind of virus that drags them down, and then they keep training, and the combination puts them into this overtraining state. That happens. But another way it happens, and the probably more typical way it happens, is just a long-term pushing the volume and the total load too hard and not recovering. Because basically one way of calling it is overtraining, but you could call it also under recovery syndrome. And it's pretty hard to distinguish the two because they're two sides of the same coin. And in fact, if you look at the historical literature, under recovery has been one of the terms that's been used. And I should forgive you, Trevor, for also using burnout, because that term has also been used synonymously with overtraining. So the literature itself has been kind of, inconsistent. And I think part of that is just science has taken a while to figure this out. They've looked at different things, seen different symptomologies, different snapshots of what we might say is a continuum. And I think that's where we're at in our understanding of this, is that we're really looking at a continuum in a stress and recovery kind of balance, and different degrees that this stress recovery balance becomes shifted or out of balance, and how the body responds.
Now let's go to episode 91. Beyond the data, training is not only about numbers. We just snuck this in. This was back in January of 2020. This is a little bit more about what you were just describing, Trevor, about the execution sometimes is just as critical, if not more so, than hitting any particular number. Tell us a little bit more about what we'll hear.
So this next bit is with Julie Young, who is an accomplished coach, physiologist, and an elite level athlete herself. She has, I'm happy to say, become a big part of our Fast Talk Labs family over the last year. But first communication I personally ever had with her was at the end of 2019. We got into this email conversation about all the ways that training and strength and the assets of an athlete don't just show up in the numbers. And it was such an interesting email conversation that at the end of it, I just said, hey, could you come on the show? Let's have this conversation on the show. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. And what you're about to hear is one excerpt from this conversation of the things that don't show up in the numbers.
So Julie and I, during our conversations, we came up with a list of some of the areas that both of us as coaches feel are absolutely critical to training, critical to performance that just don't show up in the numbers. So I'm just going to do the quick list, and then we can take a deeper dive into each of these. But first one is I really like Julie's terminology for this: building mental and physical competence. The next one that's a big one for me is knowing and focusing on the big picture. And that includes having both balance and perspective, and also having purpose and goals. So Julie, let's throw it back to you and tell us a little bit about what you mean by mental and physical competence.
So for me, and again, I go back to podcasts you guys have done, and you talk about executing the workouts, and I think you guys did a great job explaining that sound training is not this ever-changing like circus of workouts where you're simply just trying to entertain the athlete, but it's a core group of workouts that the athlete does better and better and better. And to me, execution is not about chasing a number on my power meter. It's about using that as a reference and definitely getting into that zone, but mentally, like using that training session to put yourself in an upcoming race, like an important piece of an upcoming race, like visualizing yourself while you're doing this intense workout and mentally visualizing yourself in that part of that race. And I think thinking about ways that, you mentally, you take your mind beyond the discomfort of the physical sensations, and whether it's focusing on a fluid pedal stroke, your breathing, your posture, whatever it is, but essentially these are things that you're going to lean on in the race. I know for myself, like being in races, I'll fall back on, a training session and just say to myself, hey, this is no big deal. This is just a hill interval. So for me, like the execution is really about, again, mentally using that interval to put yourself in an upcoming race versus just, again, chasing that power number or mentally ticking off the time. I think we lose out on a lot of the benefits of training when we approach it that way. And I feel like when you can attach this mental like visualization, you're going to glean so much more effectiveness out of your training sessions.
Another example I'll give, this is one of my favorites because it's just a pure example, is hill climbing. One of the things that I think is really valuable to get out of training is a sense of yourself, a sense of how hard can I do a 5-minute effort, or a climb? How hard can I do a 10-minute? How hard can I do a 30-minute? And really get a sense of your own limits. And you see that with riders who learn that and build that confidence in a race versus riders who don't have that confidence. Riders who don't know themselves well, who don't have that confidence, when they hit the climb, they're just going to bury themselves to stay with the leaders until they absolutely explode. Where a really experienced, confident rider, when they hit that climb, they know, okay, I can handle a few surges at this pace. They know the line of, if I go over this line, I'm going to explode, and I'm going to avoid that as much as I can. And ultimately, they know what is their pace for whatever the length of the climb is. And you see very experienced riders, they might respond to 1 or 2 surges, but if they assess this is too hard for me, they're actually going to let the leaders go, drop into their own pace, knowing that's their best chance to get over the climb. And anybody who's watched the tour, you'll see this, where sometimes the tour leader gets attacked, doesn't respond at all because he just knows that's too hard for me, but I don't think this guy can hold that pace. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, they're bringing that person back. And that takes a huge amount of confidence. It takes a huge amount of self-awareness. And I think that's beyond knowing the numbers, because the numbers in training and the numbers of what you can do in a race are different. It's a feel thing, and it's a confidence thing.
I think for me too, I think there's this sense of like, I think all the great like athletes and champions have this incredible sense of calm and composure. And I think that's a huge part, when you have that confidence, it's just, it's this calmness. And you can deal with the situations. And again, I think in training, it gives you those mental focuses that, again, it's not just chasing, like for me, just personally chasing a power number on my device. I feel like I'm wrestling my bike. I don't feel like I'm fast and efficient. But when I focus on, okay, pedal stroke, rhythm, breathing, posture, those kind of things, that makes me a better rider. And I think that's like, again, in the race situations, to mentally take the focus there and find that calm and that composure, to me, results in a good performance.
Now let's hear a little bit from episode 101, Zones Are a Range and Not a Specific Number, featuring an all-star cast of guests. And in this clip, we're going to hear from one of the biggest all-stars in American cycling right now, Sepp Kuss. You've seen him on TV probably, kicking butt in the mountains of some Grand Tours. But this is another one where we talk a little bit about execution, training zones not being necessarily a constant thing. Trevor, tell us a little bit more about what we're going to hear.
Yeah, if there's one message we wanted to get across in this episode, it goes, as you said, it goes back to execution. And it's this idea that if you have a zone, so let's say your threshold zone is 270 watts to 300 watts, there's this belief that, well, I should be riding at 300 watts. And what we are trying to communicate in this episode is, no, it's a range for a reason. And some days that 300 watts might be right. Other days, closer to 270 might be right. So what I love about this clip is we had Sepp Kuss on the show, who tends to be a power guy and tends to focus on the numbers when he's doing intervals. But even somebody who's more on the power side, the number side, you hear him say, I go out, I see how I feel that day, and then I adjust the number.
So we've discussed this before. There are many, but I'm really going to focus on 4 here. Part of the reason I want to focus on these 4 is there's a lot of different zone models out there. There's simple ones like Dr. Seiler has this 3-zone model. I've seen zone systems that have 9 different zones. Mm-hmm. When you actually look at our physiology, there's only a few key breakpoints. So a lot of these zones are just these zone models are based maybe on experience, maybe on what athletes do, mm-hmm. but you can't point to something physiological and say there was a change there, something was going on there. So when you're talking about if you did a lactate test or a ramp test and we were looking at what was going on physiologically, here's the key breakpoints. Obviously, there's the 2 thresholds. There is your aerobic threshold, mm-hmm. and there's your anaerobic threshold. Aerobic threshold is that point where if you were doing a lactate test, you start seeing that rise in lactate. So a proper lactate test, you would have a few stages where your lactates are going to stay low depending on your level, somewhere around 1.2. You're not going to see lactate rise at all. Aerobic threshold is after you start to see that rise. So there is a clear physiological change that is happening. And there's a lot of explanations. Again, we don't want to go too deep into the weeds. We've done episodes on this. This is kind of the summary. But one of the beliefs, I believe in this, one of the things that's happening when you hit that aerobic threshold is now you're starting to recruit those 2A fibers. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to bring in fast twitch muscle fibers. Article that I really liked called Lactate Threshold Concepts, How Valid Are They? Mm-hmm. And most of what I was just explaining is summarized in this review. Another one called Exercise Intensity Thresholds, Identifying the Boundaries of Sustainable Performance by Dr. Keir. Those would be the 2 that I would say kind of explain a lot of this and explain this interesting contradiction where, like you said, on the one hand, it's very fluid, and we mentioned this in the previous episode. When physiologists talked about lactate threshold, they're talking about that entire range between that aerobic threshold and that anaerobic threshold, or MLSS. Mm-hmm. Because, as we said, aerobic threshold is the point where you start to see the rise in lactate. Hence, you've now hit a lactate threshold. Mm-hmm. Yet there are still these key break points where they go, even though this whole thing is fluid, there's these 2 points where it's clear below this, one thing's going on, above this, another thing is going on.
Right.
And they have an impact. The last thing to bring up about that anaerobic threshold that's been mentioned multiple times in many studies, Dr. Seiler wrote a little bit about this, but above that anaerobic threshold, above that MLSS, there is a disproportionate increase in sympathetic nervous system activity. So I could go deep into the weeds in this, but basically what all these studies say, and in particular the one I would recommend is one called, it's an older one, Plasma Catecholamines During Endurance Exercise of Different Intensities as Related to the Individual Anaerobic Threshold. How's that for a name? And that was in the European Journal of Applied Physiology back in 1994. But the gist of it is there is a toll that you take when you go above anaerobic threshold. There are certainly some sympathetic stress when you're between those two thresholds, but you get above that anaerobic threshold and all of a sudden you're really hitting the system. There is going to be a price to pay that you don't pay below. Hence the reason we've often said you got to be careful about that work above anaerobic threshold. You just can't do it every day because of this sympathetic stress, because of the sort of damage it's doing to your system and the increased need for recovery after this sort of work.
When you do intervals, is it purely by power heart rate, or is there a feel component?
For me, it's usually just by power only. I've never done heart rate. Yeah, I usually set myself up with numbers that are pretty doable. Never really reaching for a number. I mean, some days will be harder than others, but yeah, the way I do the intervals, I go into them knowing, yeah, this is a number or perceived exertion that is not easy, but something that's attainable and repeatable day to day or interval to interval. So yeah, it's hard to describe it, but I'd say at the end of the day, I never feel like, oh, that was a 10 out of 10, just awful day, hard. At the end of the day, it's like, oh, that was maybe 8 out of 10 difficulty, but I could do it again tomorrow. So I'd say that's my general, feeling.
Right. You said you're going to look at the power. Let's say you doing intervals and you say, I'm going to be doing these intervals at 400 watts. Mm-hmm. Do you consider how you feel at all? I mean, if you go out and one day they're killing you, another day they feel easy. Mm-hmm. Do you just say, I'm going to ignore how that feels and I'm going to stick with the 400 watts? Or do you listen to how you feel and say, maybe today I need to back down or today I can step it up a little?
Yeah, I think usually if it takes me about, two intervals to truly feel how I'll feel that day or that session or whatever. So yeah, definitely if I feel like crap, I think, okay, well, what did I do? What does the training look like before? What have I been eating? And then, I'll make a decision. Maybe I shouldn't be doing the interval at all if I feel that awful, or maybe I should push through maybe at a lower power and just make that new number the new standard for just that day. But yeah, it's always a tough call because you always want to be, at least for me, I always want to be at the top of what I can do. But another component is, thinking big picture, for later in the week or for, the next week's training, what you need to do, save yourself or
right.
Not.
So going through a couple different interval types, how are you? So when you're doing more of a threshold type workout, mm-hmm. and I don't know what sort of length thresholds, whether you're doing shorter 5 minute or you like the 20 minute type threshold workout, which I'd love to hear. But how do you gauge with a threshold workout? Is it pure power, or how do you know what sort of intensity to hold with that, and how are you pacing yourself for the workout?
Honestly, it's pretty, robotic for me, I guess. I say, this is the number, and you just got to do it. For me, I think there's the mental component too. It's hard for me just to say, okay, I'm doing this number for for 20 minutes, I'm going to say, oh, I'll do 3 minutes this number with a minute this number for 20 minutes. And then that's easier for me to do than just staring at a line.
He sees how he feels, and then he adjusts the numbers. And this is important. The range changes. It changes day to day. It changes over the course of a ride, or what's optimal for you. So we can say your range is 160 to 190. And some days, yeah, right at 190 is going to give you the best gains. But the next day, that might be too hard.
Yep.
A couple of days later, that might be too easy. That's why you need to look at the range, listen to how you feel, and say, I'm not feeling as good today. I'm going to drop it down. I'm going to go lower in the range. Or you can have a day where you're feeling really good and go, okay, I'm going to push it a little today. I'm going to push the upper end of that range. But if you just sit there and say, this is the number, I have to hit that number. Or let's say you're on a trainer doing intervals and you just lock in that trainer at what you think your FTP is. So let's say it's that 280 and you just go, I've got to do 280. You're having a bad day. You're a little fatigued. You're going to get disappointed because you're not going to be able to get through those intervals. They're going to feel like crap. And you're just going to say, what's wrong with me? I did 280 a week ago. Am I getting less fit? No, it varies. Last week, 280 was right. This week, maybe you should have done 270. But you need to vary it. And that's a day-to-day thing, but even on the course of a ride, if you're going out doing a 5-hour ride, 190 might be right at the start of that ride.
Mm-hmm.
That might be too high at the end of that ride. And we think when we create these zones, we think of ourselves a little too much like machines. And when you start thinking about the edges, I need to sit right at the edge of my zone, then you're really turning yourself into a machine and you're not allowing that day-to-day fluctuation. A good zone model is going to allow that fluctuation. It is a range. And that's why you have to look at each day. Okay, my zone 2 is 160 to 190. Today, I'm closer to 160. Tomorrow, I'm closer to 190.
Now let's turn our attention to episode 131, Balancing Science and Experience in Your Training. This was with Cameron Cogburn. Trevor, take us inside this episode a little bit more about that idea that experience is essentially an N of 1.
The idea of this clip here is, those of us in the science, we really focus on, you need lots and lots of subjects to be able to get good data. You want to do a study, the more people, the better. So you want a big N. But when we're talking about us as individuals with our own individual training, it's actually the N of 1 is all that's important. So a study with a whole bunch of people in it might say, well, here's generally what's effective, but you might be an outlier. You might be different. So what's important to you is where you lie.
Let's start by really defining what we mean by science and what we mean by experience.
No easy feat here to try to encapsulate the totality of both here. The best place to start when looking at a definition is just, you can go straight to the dictionary here. If you look up science, there are a couple of definitions, but the state of knowing, knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding, and B, a department of systematized knowledge as an object of study, as something providing a framework for knowledge. I think that's kind of the working definition. Similarly with experience, 2 definitions stood out to me. And the first one is a direct observation of or participation in events as a basis of knowledge. And B, practical knowledge, skill, or practice derived from direct observation of or participation in events or in a particular activity. So more kind of a grounding of knowledge as a consequence of events, basically.
The way I think of these, particularly when we're talking about helping out athletes, I always think of science as the law of the bell-shaped curve. So what you are doing is, think of it as when you're doing a study, they talk about N, which is the number of subjects or the number of whatever it is you're studying. So the higher the N value, the more scientific power it has.
Because what you're looking for is trends. And the idea is the best science, you are taking any bias out of it. So let's say we're talking about studying a particular sports drink formula. You really just want to say, we're going to take a group of subjects, we're going to test them with this formula, we're going to test them up against a placebo, and we're just going to see if it shows whether it improved their performance or not. You've taken the bias out of it. The more subjects you have, the stronger the statement you can make. Experience to me is the N of one, which in many ways for you is all that matters. So science will say, here's the general trend. We saw it helped a lot of people, but whenever you have a large sample, it's really going to help some, it's not going to help others. Again, it's that bell-shaped curve. What you care about is you. Did it help you? So I always think of experience being this N of one is all that matters.
Right.
That sort of gets at the shortcomings of each in a nutshell. The science, because it's about a large number of people, it doesn't always apply on an individual level because individuals can be unique and different. On the experience side, what works for you it can't necessarily or doesn't necessarily work for your training partner or somebody else on your team that you're mentoring. So that's a little glimpse into the shortcomings of each of these things. What are some of the other shortcomings?
So on that bell-shaped curve, and I'll throw this to Cameron, there are what are called outliers. And I'm a strong believer that all of us are an outlier somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're, for instance, looking at a specific study, as you mentioned, Trevor, that most scientific papers, they try to analyze phenomena in the aggregate and then from that derive, a general principle. However, you might have an individual response to that. For instance, if it's a training modality or nutrition, you might have an individual response to that intervention. In most scientific papers, that they're not 100% of the participants get the same outcomes. And so I think it is important to recognize that individuality does come into play when interpreting these papers and other, scientific principles. And the more, I guess, experience you have and the more you know yourself and what kind of works and does not work for you, the better you can interpret certain results and know ahead of time whether they'll be applicable, whether they won't necessarily be as useful to you or not.
This next one is a bit of a fun episode that we did with Ruth Winder. Chris, you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, she won the national championship race. Gosh, that was now 2019. And this episode was all about how to be aggressive in races. And her tactic, her experience within that national championship race was exactly what we were talking about in this episode. Noticing the right time to make the move, how to understand the different players, when to get away, how to use teammates to be aggressive, how to be a little bit coy at times, but also then once you are aggressive, you can't let up. You have to then put your head down and as she likes to say, cycling is pain. You just got to go with it. And fingers crossed, a lot of the times it doesn't work out, but fingers crossed, sometimes it does. And this was a perfect example of how you can turn aggressive racing into a big win.
So at Nationals, we do, for anybody that didn't watch the race, we do a circuit, which we did 7 times, that has, I think it's about a 5-minute climb. It's fairly steep. And then after that, we have a pretty steep, somewhat technical descent that then drops you out onto kind of this highway road. So you have a hard climb and then a pretty fast descent. And so Taylor had been going really hard up the climb to just try and string it out. And then I didn't. So typically when a teammate goes really hard, then as soon as that person is brought back and comes back to the field, the second there's the lull, you need to, the thing is to attack, to go right away. which I knew everybody would be waiting for because that's like what everybody does. Like you do that. So I waited past that point and nobody else went, there was already a small breakaway up the road at this point, actually. There was already, I think, 3 or 4 riders up the road. But when Taylor had gone really hard up the climb, I think everybody else would just like kind of stopped and started to look at each other and like, oh, are you going to go? Are you going to go? And nobody did. And then I waited past that lull and then I came up to Taylor and I made sure I did it in a way so that there wasn't somebody on my wheel that I knew would be able to chase me down immediately. And this person was Katie. I knew Katie was on my wheel, and I have a bunch, when I attack with speed, I have quite a lot of speed. And Katie is a fantastic climber, but doesn't have Katie Hall doesn't have as much speed when she attacks. So I thought, okay, Katie's on my wheel. But I came alongside Taylor and I just made it look like I was going to have a conversation with Taylor, which I didn't. I just asked her if she was okay, and she was like, yeah, I'm okay. And then I just attacked. Which honestly, when I went, it's one of those things that I'm like, well, I'm going to go because Taylor's just, everybody's on the limit a little bit here. Like she's just done pretty hard over this climb. It's a good chance because there's definitely a lull. Like no, people are not paying as much attention right now. It was still 21 miles from the finish, so it's still fairly long way to go. So people are going to be like, we'll get her. Like she has time kind of a thing. So I kind of in my mind was like, well, this is a good time to go to set up Taylor. Honestly, I was like, Taylor was feeling so strong on that climb. Like I'm just going to go. And then when I get brought back, then Taylor can go again on the climb or something like that. Like that's what I was thinking at that time. I don't normally look at my power when I'm racing, but then after that I switched my power meter so that I could see the screen with my power so that I knew that I was riding within myself at a fairly good speed. And eventually I caught the couple of girls that were off the front, which was really good because then I was able to get some recovery and work with them a little bit. And then going over the climb, only one girl stayed with me, and then which was also good to have someone with me for some period of time.
Right.
And I was really wanted to be with her, so that was really good. And she was really working hard. And
that's a little bit of a mental boost for that period of time.
Yeah. And then it was just like the gap got fairly, I don't even remember how big it got now, maybe a minute and a half or something. Like it got fairly big. And then with 1 lap to go, it's funny, on the course is this out and back section. So I could see in the follow car was Taylor Wild's wife, Olivia, and then my boyfriend, Zach, was in the car. And you're allowed radios at Nationals, but my radio hadn't been working, so I hadn't heard anything. But then I just could see them in the car as we went, as we doubled back on the course. And they were just out of the car, banging on the car, come on, keep going. And at this point, for the last lap, I just went as hard as I could, and I eventually dropped the girl that I was with, and I changed my power back from with a lap to go. I changed it back so I couldn't see the power anymore, and I was just staring at the white line on the road, doing that right here, right now moment, going as fast as I could go and just keep pushing on the pedals as hard as I could go. And the field was getting really, really close behind me. Actually, they got, when I was probably 3 miles from the finish, I looked behind me and I was like, okay, any moment now they're going to catch me. It's just going to be a matter of time, but we're 3 miles to go, so I can't stop. You have to just keep going. You have to keep going. And then when we got to the last mile, I knew we had a few turns, and so I was literally just sprinting between every turn, just using the corner as recovery, and just you could breathe when you get to the corner, but you have to sprint between every corner. And then crossed the line just in front of Corinne, and I just couldn't believe it.
Let's now take a look at episode 113. The duration and intensity of rest periods is as critical as your intervals, with Sebastian Weber. Again, I don't think we could have a best of 2020 episode without Sebastian Weber. And this is, Sebastian at his best, being a little bit sassy, as he likes to be, a little bit particular about definitions and terms. So, Trevor, please take us inside this clip and tell us a little bit more about what we're going to hear.
And we have to point out, this is our producer Jana's favorite clip of the year. She thought this was fun. This is just us talking about 5-minute, what are generally referred to as VO2 max intervals, and we were trying to analyze the effectiveness of them, but it quickly turned into what would you call it? A mean girl gossip session about 5-minute intervals. We got pretty bad. What you don't know about this clip is we had a rant about 5-minute intervals, and then we got back on topic and then did a second rant on 5-minute intervals because we just hadn't had enough of beating up on those intervals. And when we edited it, we put the two together, but that was how much we wanted to attack these intervals.
All the while the Swiss cowbells were ringing in the background for Sebastian. As I remember, we recorded this. He was at home. The cowbells were ringing. It was a great recording. Here we are with Sebastian Weber. Yeah, let's stop being so boring and let's talk about a different type of interval here. Let's talk about the all-out but long interval. Say it's a 5-minute interval and it's full gas.
Yeah. And this is just, particularly in North America, the common nomenclature for this is VO2 max intervals.
Right.
So they tend to be 4 or 5 minutes in length, and they're all out.
Yeah, maybe we should do a podcast, one whole session about why you call this VO2 max interval.
There's a whole bunch of terms that just have become the terms that you could really dive into. And
well, we won't refer. We don't have to refer to them as such, but let's just define them as 5 minutes in length and all out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd say 4 to 5 minutes, and you should be bleeding from the eyes by the end of that.
Okay, so let's assume you do that, and let's don't touch on it why you do that, or maybe why you don't do that. Talking about the recovery, right?
Yes.
The issue is here, and that's the main issue with recovery periods, is that you are maxing out different systems, right? You're maxing out your creatine phosphate stores because those will be depleted at the end of this exercise. You are maxing out your pH levels in terms of decreasing those. You will most likely maxing out your lactate concentration, which you can handle, so to speak, simplified. You're maxing out your VO2, obviously, that's part of it. And the issue with the rest period is that you have now different systems you need to recover, and they have different time kinetics, how long it takes them to recover, and they have different intensity at which they recover the best. And this becomes the complicated thing here, so to speak, if your intention is to bring back all systems to full recovery, which is needed if you want to at least try to repeat the same exercise, right? So let's say if you create a session here, to be more precise on what kind of intervals you're talking about, if you create a session where you say, I go the first one full out, and then I use this power as a reference for the following 3, 4, I don't know how many reps you want to do, and use this as my reference point and try to hit the same number. If this is what you're doing, then you need to recover and restore all those different systems. And again, they recover at different durations, at different intensities. And this is the tricky part here.
Yeah, and this goes back to our discussion about the perturbance and what Sebastian is saying now, that one system takes X number of seconds or minutes to fully restore itself. Another system takes a different length of time, and you might want to have them all restored. You probably do want to have them all restored, but if you don't do them the right way, one might be fully restored, another might be 75% restored. So that's why it gets pretty complex. Is that what we're saying here?
Yeah, it is pretty complex, but on the other hand, you're talking mostly about two systems here. You're just talking about the phosphocreatine system, and you're talking about the lactate system, and therefore the pH values. And the results you just cited or summarized here are not really surprising, because in this study, the intensity in the recovery phase was comparable low. Like it was basically like a fast walking, right?
Right. And this was runners, we should mention.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this was runners, and they ran at 5 kilometers per hour, I guess, for the recovery it was. And this is a good walk, right?
Yeah.
So at this intensity, the rate of lactate recovery, so the rate per minute, per second, whatsoever, how much lactate you can clear from your system in the muscle is relatively low, especially in this population he had there. Walking for 2 minutes or for 4 minutes doesn't change a whole lot here in terms of the lactate.
Right.
Right? It's not a huge difference. We are maybe talking about 0.5 millimole or something-ish like ballpark. And what happens at this low intensity is that you will recover your creatine phosphate stores in the first approximately 1.5 to 2.5 minutes, depending on, mostly depending on how good you are aerobically. So how big is your aerobic engine? How big is your VO2 max? So therefore, it is no surprise that you don't see a difference between the 2 and the 4, no significant difference between the 2 and the 4 minutes recovery. Because basically, the recovery of the creatine phosphate system will not change significantly between 2 and 4 minutes. And the recovery of lactate will change, but the impact, the effect of that is rather small. Yeah. So this is why the directed or prescribed recovery phases show this pattern. And then the self-selected one is also refers to the same mechanics, basically. The self-selected one is because you feel recovered or you feel better when your creatine phosphate system is recovered or is replenished. We just talked about before, talking about those long intervals that, for example, in the pro cyclist, but also in amateur recreational cyclists, the self-selected intensity for recovery is most likely never too hard, but if so, too easy, right? And that's the first thing that happens when you do a hard interval and your best recovery rate for recovering lactate is, let's say, 180 watts, your threshold is 300, you do your threshold intervals. Or even after those 4 or 5 minutes, it doesn't feel good. It feels pretty ugly, so to speak, to jump from 300, 400, 500 watts back to 200. It feels much better if initially you just stop pedaling, right? Or just pedal with 50 watts or something. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because the force your muscle can create is related to the creatine phosphate content. So when you replenish your creatine phosphate, and again, this process is, it's not linear, right? But you're close to the maximum replenishment of creatine phosphate, again, depending on your oxygen kinetics and VO2 max, approximately after 2 minutes. So after that time, you feel strong again. And therefore, it's natural that athletes will repeat in the next interval or are more inclined to restart again. And if you want to have an idea on how this feels like or what's going on there, just imagine. And this also tells a story about how quick this process is. Imagine you're riding very, very hard, like in a bunch or something, right? You're almost riding at your limit. And it's about to do a little attack. It's about to go out of the saddle and push hard for just a few reps here. Imagine doing this when you're on your limit versus just stop pedaling for 2 seconds, right? If you just leave out, so to speak, a few pedal strokes, preparing for a sprint or just a little attack, you will immediately feel a little bit stronger. And this is the fast first phase of creatine phosphate recovery. And again, the force that you can produce and therefore the torque, and which is obviously important in acceleration, depends highly on the phosphorylation of the muscle cell, which is creatine phosphate restoration. So these findings make absolutely sense in terms of muscle energetics.
And I'm going to just say, so you said if you do these intervals, you feel better if you just stop pedaling afterwards and fully rest. Part of the reason I don't like giving these intervals to my athlete is I'm going to take that a step further and say you feel better if you do these intervals right, if you run into the woods and get ready your lunch. These are not fun. And I get the sense you do not like this type of interval. I would love to dive into that just for even a couple minutes.
Yeah, educate the North American listener as to why you don't like these, why these are not effective in your mind. That's the sense I got as well.
I didn't say that I don't like them.
No? Okay.
No, I'm just, I just struggle. It's just difficult to talk to people about VO2 max intervals because there's two assumptions in here. One assumption that most people have when they hear VO2 max intervals, they assume that this is the only way or the one way to increase your VO2 max, which it isn't.
Right.
And then the second question is, and we had this running up for this recording today, what is the intensity? what is the intensity that describes VO2 max? And this is where, there's a lot of misunderstanding. And therefore, I'm just very careful about these intervals, because I first would like to understand, what are we talking about here, right? Are we talking about the intensity, the power output, the energy turnover that equals VO2 max? Or are we talking about an intensity at which you reach VO2 max in any kind of incremental step test, REM test, all out test whatsoever, right? Like, is it a power output associated with you recording your VO2 max and whatever setting? Then we are linked in this definition. We are linked to the testing protocol, right? So that's my difficulty here. And then in terms of doing it, well, I have no direct offense against it. I'm a little bit biased here in terms of when you do these kind of intervals with professional athletes, and I have to admit that obviously I'm biased here. My mind is more with this. That's no offense. It's just because that's what I did in the past years. I mean, I've coached more amateurs beforehand, but in the recent past. And anyway, when you do these kind of intervals, where you really go all out for 4 or 5 minutes with professional athletes, it's a very, very uncommon thing. And the possibilities that you crack your athlete is quite high. I know that it's different with amateur recreational athletes, and most likely most people don't really go all out, like they don't, maybe only go to 90% or whatever of maximum. But that's why I'm a little bit careful with that, right? Because the high intensity and maxing out the duration is, to say the least, a difficult combination, I would say.
Yeah, that's actually, and damn it, we're agreeing again. I was hoping to have a little bit of back and forth, which would have been fun. But the issue I have is I do agree with you. Most people can't get into the lab and do a VO2 max test. So when you talk to people about VO2 max power, the common definition is it's your peak 5-minute wattage. And if you think of it that way, anybody who has gone out and done a proper test, all out 5 minutes, hit the highest power you can for 5 minutes, knows you're then dead for the next 20 minutes.
Yeah, those are pretty awful. It
hurts. So to do that once will absolutely make you suffer. To then say, okay, now go do 5 by 5 of that, nobody can do that.
Now let's hear a clip from episode 134, the favorite workouts of Fast Talk All-Stars. Trevor, I know why you like this clip. It's because Joe Friel, the author of the Cyclist Training Bible, well-known, extremely well-known coach, picked the same workout that you would have picked. And so let's hear a little bit more about what that workout is.
This kind of goes back to the first episode we ever recorded with Joe Friel was about the Cyclist Training Bible. And I read the book in preparation for that episode. And my comment to Chris when he asked me my opinion of the book, I was like, it's kind of scary. If I was going to write a book about cycling training, this is pretty much it. We share a lot of the same viewpoints. And so I guess it's only appropriate that when we asked him his favorite workout, he immediately described what is also my favorite workout, which is these hill repeats. So I'm not sure what this says, except I have a huge amount of respect for Joe Friel, but really appreciate the fact that the intervals I love to do are the intervals he loves to do as well.
All right, let's hear Joe's description.
Yeah, I just did mine today, actually. My favorite workout is hill repeats. I like to do them relatively long, anywhere from, say 6-7 minutes to 18-20 minutes, at about a little below like 90% of FTP or even 100% of FTP on a relatively relatively steep hill, like a 6, 7, 8% grade. And I find that to be enjoyable because I like the focus it requires. You're trying to maintain a given effort, given power output, a given heart rate, whatever you're using to regulate those intervals. And then the nice thing about doing it indoors is you can make the recovery relatively short, which is the way it should be. It should be like the recovery should be perhaps 1/4 as long as the preceding work interval. And that you can't do outdoors. When you're outdoors, you can't get back down the hill that fast. So consequently, indoors is really a great place to do that workout. So that's my favorite workout. The only other workout is the one I'll do tomorrow, which is my other favorite workout. Is just to ride really easy. Just go out and smell the roses and have a great time. And that one I like doing on the road because I can enjoy the weather and ride with my wife and have a conversation and so forth, which is difficult to do when you only have one trainer indoors.
Fair enough. So going back to the hill repeats, how many would you do? And I'm assuming that depends on the length of the climb.
No, well, it depends on how long it takes you to climb the hill. But typically anywhere from about 20 to 40 minutes total climbing time in the workout.
Okay.
And that's a good workout. When you're done with that, your legs are tired. So it's a good session.
And why would you do that workout? What are the benefits of it?
Primary benefit is improves lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold. If you want to think of it in terms of power, it improves FTP. And it's also kind of one of those things that it's not so hard that it really hurts, but it's hard enough that you're on the verge of hurting the entire time. So there's a little bit of suffering that goes on, but it's not nearly the suffering that you have in a race situation. And so I just like that effort. I find it very rewarding when I get done with that session, knowing I've put in 20, 30, 40 minutes of relatively high intensity up around FTP. It's just a good feeling.
Good. And final question about the workout is looking at the long-term training plan. Is there a particular time of year where you would use these intervals, or can they be used at any point?
They can be used at any point. What I would change is two things. Very early in the season, I would reduce the intensity to maybe something like 15 watts below threshold. So it's more like a 3-zone based on power, 3-zone effort in the base period, early base period. And I would reduce the number of intervals. So we're talking about around 20 minutes or even slightly less, maybe as few as 15 minutes for a workout. And that's a pretty good workout for just maintaining upper intensity fitness of FTP. Then as the season progresses, we move into the late base period and into the build period, and the workouts will become more intense, and gradually it also become longer in terms of total number of high intensity intervals you're doing.
Chris, I know this was an episode when we were planning it that you were really excited about when we were going to talk about randoneering and ultra endurance events. So we have a clip here that you were excited to put on this episode. Tell us about it.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I would have thought there's no way I'd be really even interested in this subject. But for many reasons, this was a favorite clip of mine. First, I have this new interest in these types of things because they turn into adventurous rides, experiences more so than it's not just a race, it's beyond that. But I think also for Fast Talk, it was just a new discipline and it opened a new door to a world that a lot of us think is a little bit of a black box, a bit of a mystery. So Matt Roy, Jose Bermudez, they both have such experience with this world that they helped us understand it a little bit more, understand that in a lot of ways it's not that much different than any other type of cycling. But at the same time, there are some very significant differences. And both of these guys get into the similarities and the differences, and it just opens people's eyes, hopefully, to a new genre.
The guy who founded D2R2, the famous dirt road event in Western Mass, this guy, Sandy Whittlesley, and he holds the record for Boston and Montreal Boston, which is the PDP equivalent of the US when it was run, 1200K. I think he did it in 44 hours and change, some insane number. he had, old cat eye halogen light with 2C batteries trying to peer his way through a rainy night in Vermont roads. And he told me how the guardrail turned into a giant snake. And he said if it wasn't a snake, he probably would have continued heading towards it. So his hallucinations saved his life. Wow. In that context.
This makes me want to ask you, Matt, tell us some strategies so that you don't allow yourself to get to this point, because this really does sound dangerous, potentially life-threatening. What have you learned over the years to stave off the urge to keep going?
I would say there's a few approaches. And so I'll just give you an idea on the mental strategy and then maybe something about the sleep strategy. The mental strategy, I've always thought about breaking things up incrementally. So I've given you these examples of 100K, 200K, 400, 300 example. So 100K with stops, a lot of hills, takes 4 hours. Anybody can ride 4 hours. You get to the next control, you hit a reset button. That reset button is mental. You get full bottles, you get some fresh snacks, maybe a baguette, and you're starting a brand new ride. And the only thing you need to do for the next 4 hours is get from that checkpoint to the next checkpoint. And each time you get to a checkpoint, it is a full reset. And if you can trick your brain into believing that, then that's half the battle. Trevor, you mentioned the sort of emotional highs and lows and this whole spectrum. And actually, that's part of the beauty of ultra cycling and how you respond to those. It's not possible to ride 12 hours without having some emotional component. There's going to be a moment where it's terrible. And it's how you address that moment to get to the other side of it that I think really brings the beauty to that sport. And for me, I've been able to compartmentalize it and say, I'm suffering, but I'm going to get to this checkpoint because that's only 45 minutes away from now if I stay at this speed. And when I get to that checkpoint, it's a new ride and I don't have to worry about those ghosts from 20 minutes ago. So that little compartmentalization is the key for me. And I even break it up even smaller. If I'm on a long, miserable, steep climb, then the next telephone pole is my goal and the one after that. And I might just be basic enough that those simple little things are enough distraction that I don't think about the clock or I don't think about the fact that I've been up since 2 a.m. or anything like that. So I compartmentalize. That's probably the first big thing.
That's called chunking in the psychological realm, and that is a strategy for that anybody could use really with any length of event, whether it's just a climb and it's really hurting and it's only an hour in length. You can still break it up into small chunks like that. Same with the hour record on the track. You want to break that up into maybe it's 8-minute segments or 10-minute segments and think of those as discrete pieces. And once you finish that, you reset and take on the next challenge.
Yeah, and there are other little logistic things you can do. You can physically break your route up on your navigation device. For Transatlantic Way, I set what were optimistic goals for days, and I had each day broken up into 2 Garmin files, and I would look at distance remaining, and it was always fairly palatable. Oh, I can ride 118 miles. I can do that. You get to that end of that file and you start a new one, and it's just less daunting. Don't beat yourself up with the number, just make it palatable. And you can cheat yourself. You can, cheat your psyche by making it into these palatable chunks. There's all these little strategies. One thing I used to do for nutrition, which we could get into, is I would set a countdown timer on a watch. And every time it would go off, I set it for like 50 minutes, 50. And every 50 minutes it would go off and I would eat. And it's just, oh, there's my dinner bell. And it was just something I didn't have to think about. Just another little incremental component.
Imagine, you could speak more to this, but imagine another thing. I mean, when I'm coaching an athlete and we're talking about a 2-hour race, we want to do everything possible to make sure they don't bonk. If you bonk in that race, you're done. When you're doing an event that's 12 hours or longer, bonking is pretty much an inevitability. probably a few times in some of these longer events. It's actually learning how to push through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like that's me emphasizing the utility of these breves building on each other. Is that's a perfect opportunity to make those mistakes. Is you learn through your own errors in these, and you can build up your skill set by making these mistakes. So I think my physiology is changing as I've done this for this is 13 years now, I guess. 13 years of long distance stuff. That I feel like I need to, maybe it's because I'm getting older too, but I'm eating a lot less than I used to. And I can ride into the front end of a bonk and know that I can rescue it. Now, when you think about the kind of output I'm doing versus the kind of output someone's doing for 2 hours, it's scaled down quite a bit. You know, we're averaging, I think PBT was, I think I averaged like 230 watts for, 44 hours of riding or something like that. I'm 145 pounds or so. So it's not like Herculean by any means. It's just a slow burn all day long. And you can feed that slow burn probably a little differently than you would do a 2-hour race athlete.
So, Chris, I know you and I both have a huge respect for Julie Emmerman. We both have worked with her, gone to races with her over the years. So you were very excited to get her on the show. And I think in this episode, she had a lot of great advice to give. So why don't you tell us a bit about what she had to say?
Yeah, this episode on performance psychology is really a broad overview of that subject, but one of those episodes where there are so many little wonderful pieces of information that you can apply to your athletic life and really to personal life. It's, psychology is an immense topic. There's a lot of concepts within that we go into in this episode, but Julie just has a way of choosing the right words. There's a lot of precision in what she does. She does this as an athlete, but she also does this as a practicing psychologist. And I love the way that she just chooses those words wisely to really explain some of these complex topics in digestible terms. So let's hear from Julie.
Another phrase I like to use is wherever you go, there you are. So if somebody comes from a past that tends to, if their history includes abuse, for example, then their self-talk might be a replication of that, when they're telling themselves some really awful things like, don't be ridiculous, just calm down. What's wrong with you? Calm down, things like that. But that's not helpful. That's just creating more constriction internally, more tension. And that is not what that person needs at that time. Then they're just feeling ashamed because they are feeling stressed. And that's, again, not helpful. So that's not a good pathway. A better pathway would be to teach that person about those abusive types of experiences and what that can lead a person to feel in terms of their self-esteem, self-agency, regulation of their own emotions, and then helping them. I work with adults, so I'm referencing adults in this situation, but helping them learn how to self-modulate and talk to themselves in a way that's more effective.
So I'm going to bring up one other study, just something that might add to the conversation a little bit. This is one I've always loved. This was from 2010, written by Jorni Rennen at the University of Barcelona. But it was a study on self-talk in tennis players. And one of the things, when they were looking at what is beneficial self-talk, they found that it was the type of self-talk that shifted the attention from being very outcome focused, being much more execution focused. So the outcome being you just sitting there going, I'm going to lose, or it's also I got to win. Shifting actually the self-talk more to talking about, well, how do I get my gear ready? What is my strategy? What am I going to be doing in the first set? What am I going to be doing in the second set? But
yeah, it goes back to a conversation we had on a previous episode about task-oriented versus goal-oriented. And maybe that's to remind folks out there that haven't listened to that episode, Julie, could you just define those two terms quickly to help people understand the context here?
Well, I'm not familiar with this study specifically, but it does sound like the focus is being brought from outcome to process. And when people are focused exclusively or too heavily on the outcome, what you often find is that then they're behavior and their thoughts are fear-based because they're like, well, what if I don't win? What if I don't win? What if I lose? Coming from a fear-based perspective is never sustainable or an effective way to manage a pressure situation. Again, it can be in a short-term way, but it is not sustainable and it is not an enjoyable way to go through a career.
Right.
So reworking some of that to help that person come from a strength-based perspective would then include things like, what are the process goals that you need to really be focused on and reminding yourself of in order to give yourself the best chance of succeeding here? And then the self-talk becomes around, okay, I need to play aggressively. I need to do this. I need to do that. And I also work with athletes to help them assess their own performances so that they know, especially at the professional level, when you are or are not giving your all. And I often, I'll debrief with people and say, okay, tell me, how did you accomplish those process goals? It doesn't matter what the score was. Tell me how well you achieved X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And let's figure out if there were obstacles. Let's work with those obstacles so that we can keep making progress.
What about visualization? Another big topic.
Yeah, it's a big topic. I never use the term visualization. Actually, I prefer imagery.
Okay.
Because when I work with an athlete around imagery and preparing for an event, I try to, first and foremost, what it would look like is having that person sit in a quiet space, whether they're sitting or lying down, closing their eyes. It relies on some visualization, but it's not exclusive to visualization. But I will have them picture in their mind. We could start from like the day before the event, when they're at registration, maybe getting nervous or whatever the situation might be. Or we may start with the warm up the next day. We'll discuss that and figure out where's the starting point. And then we will go through and try to make as alive as possible all the kinesthetic elements that we can so that that person really feels like they are there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will go through in detail, what is, if you're a triathlete, picturing yourself in the water, what does it feel like? Oh, you just got kicked in the face, or whatever the situation may be. It's cold, it's raining, whatever it is. Trying to incorporate as many different elements as possible and imagining what it would look like for them to carry out their best swim. What do they need to do to execute their very best swim? And to see themselves, but also feel it, really like it's a very alive exercise.
You hope it's immersive in that way.
Yeah.
Like they're feeling and seeing themselves in that place, not just, it's not a casual thing.
Right. And again, it goes back to something we started with. It's not just like I don't want it to be an intellectual exercise. I want them to feel as much as they can.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do that and we'll do like a run through of, when things are running pretty smoothly. And then we will also go through and bring in different elements that could be derailing. Oh, you're a triathlete and you're doing an Ironman, you just got a flat, or, you're noticing that you're dehydrated or this or that, or it's really windy. Things to help them practice what it will be like so that, again, we're rehearsing so that when they're there, it might not be that we've covered the exact thing that actually unfolds in the race itself, but they've been preparing for when things don't go perfectly and they can handle that adversity and hopefully move on as best they can.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. That was the final episode of Fast Talk in the year 2020. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts, and be sure to leave us a rating and a review. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. As always, we love your feedback. Join the conversation at forums.fasttalklabs.com and discuss each and every episode. Become a member of Fast Talk Laboratories at fasttalklabs.com/join and become a part of our education and coaching community. For the many exceptional guests we've been able to bring to you today, to all of the guests that have appeared in all of our 2020 episodes, and to my tireless co-host, Coach Trevor Connor, I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.